More and more married couples are choosing to keep their finances separate.
But does that make doing things like taxes trickier? Personal finance expert Kimberly Palmer with NerdWallet joins us this morning to talk more about the pros and the cons of separate bank accounts. Good morning, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Okay, tell us why we're seeing more married couples keeping their finances separate. Is this something that's generational, a generational trend?
It really speaks to the fact that these days people get married much later than they did decades ago. So they already have established financial systems. They're used to having their own savings accounts, their own income, their own retirement accounts all set up already. And so it just feels right to continue keeping separate accounts. So it's really a function of that later marriage age on average.
Well, at my house, we have his, hers, and ours, and we don't fight finances, and it is such a beautiful thing. But let's talk about the pros and cons of married couples having separate bank accounts. Let's start with the pros.
Well, I think what your comment really highlights the biggest pro, which is that people really enjoy that independence, privacy, freedom. No one is looking over your shoulder to see how you're spending money or telling you to do it differently because you have your own account. And for a lot of people, that's so important. And that's really essential even to making sure that it's a strong marriage and keeping that marriage healthy. But for other people, it is also helpful. Some people prefer that joint account. And that's because it can help with coordination, especially when you're talking about having shared financial goals, shared expenses. Sometimes when you have separate accounts, the downside is that it does take some additional coordination, especially when you're talking about managing shared expenses. So you might take, for example, your approach that you just said, which is a great hybrid where you're coordinating by having that joint account on top of those separate accounts.
Now, when you have separate bank accounts, does that make anything tricky, like filing taxes, so to speak?
Well, it doesn't have a direct impact on filing taxes, but it does make some other things tricky. And that is specifically when you are managing and coordinating your savings for shared financial goals and also your shared expenses. So it might take some additional behind the scenes work. For example, some people take their approach of just automatically contributing a certain amount, and it doesn't have to be an equal amount, but a certain amount into expenses each month, like a rent or a mortgage. Because of course, when you're married, you do have some joint shared expenses. You also probably have some joint goals. You might want to each contribute into an account for a vacation that you're planning or a down payment fund. So there's all sorts of behind the scenes communication and coordination that goes on.
Okay, so let's put all emotions aside here when it comes to the money. Financially speaking only, do you find it better one way or the other financially, whether you have separate or combined bank accounts?
Well, it's such an interesting question because there's no answer that is right for everyone. It's so personal. And what it really comes down to is having that conversation before you get married to talk about the expectations and what each person is used to and what works best. And I think as long as you have that communication, then either approach can work great. It's just a matter of deciding together. And of course, it can change. I mean, you might start one way in your marriage and then decide to try the other approach later on. So you don't have to set in stone the approach you're using. You can be flexible.
Now, what advice would you share with couples who are trying to decide whether to or not to merge their accounts?
I think the best advice is to really think about how you communicate about money now, and that can help you figure out what will work best. Because if one person, for example, loves the freedom of having that ability to spend without feeling like anyone else is monitoring it, then separate accounts could be the way to go. But if you really prefer that added communication and jointness of having everything together, and that just feels right to you, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
All right,
Great
Kimberly with NerdWallet. There we go. We have all the facts. Good to talk to you this morning.
Thank you.
We're at 8:19.